Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversations with Diplomats. I'm Kimberly Marten. I'm the director of the program on U.S.-Russia relations at Columbia's Harriman Institute and also a professor of political science at Barnard College. I'm joined today by Stephen Sestanovich, the Davis Professor of International Diplomacy at the School of International and Public Affairs here at Columbia University, also a member of the Harriman Institute, and somebody who served as a diplomat who had a lot to do with the situation that the United States faced when many exciting things were happening in Russia in the 1990s in particular. So, Steve, a lot of our students dream about being diplomats. I hear this all the time. You ended up becoming the ambassador at large for the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union under Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. How did that happen?
Well, it happened because the Clinton administration decided that it wanted to have a change in the bureaucratic structure for dealing with the new states of the former Soviet Union. And so President Clinton first appointed his friend Strobe Talbot to take this position. He didn't make him assistant secretary, but instead ambassador at large. By the time the job fell to me, 5 years later, it was the intention of the administration to make it an assistant secretary position, to create a regular bureau of the State Department dealing with these states, and to call the person who ran that office Assistant Secretary for East European and Eurasian Affairs. I never saw that transformation take place, and in fact it never took place because the Congress did not approve of the idea. Senator Helms had the view that if the State Department organized itself the way the Soviet Union was organized, that is to say, took all the countries of the former Soviet Union and put them in one bureau, that the Soviet Union would somehow live on. And he disapproved of this idea and so blocked the creation of such a bureau. The advantage for me of this was I get to be on your program as a former ambassador because Senator Helms wanted me to keep that title, ambassador, instead of becoming assistant secretary.
Okay.
But I will tell you, there are many other ways to become an ambassador, even in our slightly peculiar system. And we can talk about those if you want. The two most commonly used are to take the Foreign Service exam and do extremely well in the Foreign Service, thereby 15 or 20 years down the road getting nominated by some president to be ambassador to some little country, usually is your first place, a starter embassy it's called. And the other way is to give an immense amount of money to a presidential candidate. Because I was appearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for confirmation in this position as ambassador at large, some of the senators assumed that I was in the second category of people who'd made huge contributions to the president's campaign.
And were you in that category?
I was not. But they knew that I wasn't a Foreign Service officer. I had worked in and out of government, but they knew that I wasn't a career diplomat. And so they assumed that I must have been a big donor. So I had a very amusing exchange with Senator Sarbanes, in which he tried to nose out who had contacted me for what donations, when I had been offered the particular position. And it all kind of fell apart because I couldn't help him with any of these details.
Well, that's especially funny because you actually have a record of bipartisanship based on the positions that you've served in. I have a list here. You've really moved back and forth between Republican and Democratic administrations. You served as a senior legislative assistant to Democratic Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. You became a policy planner for the Department of State and then the senior director for policy development at the National Security Council in the administration of Republican President Ronald Reagan. Right. And then a decade later, you joined Democratic President Bill Clinton as ambassador and special advisor for Madeleine Albright. I mean, that's pretty impressive that you could navigate all of those different political minefields.
Well, it doesn't happen very often in Washington. I'm not a very partisan person, but Washington is a very partisan place.
Probably even more now than it was
and
then.
It is somewhat difficult to get people to believe that you're actually not just in one camp or the other. When I was working for Senator Moynihan and then offered this job at the policy planning staff, my appointment was actually vetoed by the Office of Presidential Personnel because they said, I was told, they didn't like the idea of hiring a staffer from a Democratic senator.
Okay.
And they had their own people to reward. Right. They thought, now it turned out that their own people that they wanted to reward included somebody in the Office of Presidential Personnel who wanted the job at policy planning himself.
Yeah, that's a bit of a conflict of interest.
Yeah. In the end, this got sorted out, partly because of some oddities in our electoral laws. I was not actually registered in the District of Columbia at the time. I have ever since then been registered as an independent.
Okay.
But I was able to tell the Office of Presidential Personnel that I was a registered Republican in Massachusetts, completely by chance, because I had voted for Howard Baker in the 1980 presidential primary. I didn't tell them whom I'd voted for, actually. I just said that I voted Republican, and because of that, I was registered by Massachusetts law as a Republican.
Okay.
Quite unknown to me. I found this out only in the course of this haggle with the presidential appointment people. But at any rate, even though you take a job like that in Washington at a relatively junior level, you then become affiliated in people's minds with that party. So for a long time after that, people assumed, even though I told them, no, I'm an independent, I don't really have any partisan affiliation or even really preferences, they thought I was a Republican. And this played some part, actually, in my appointment by the Clinton administration, because they thought it was kind of cool to pick somebody who was seen to have good relations with Republicans, and also sympathetic to their policy toward Russia. They thought that was a twofer. They weren't compromising on substance, but they got the frisson of bipartisanship. I told them too I wasn't a Republican, but it didn't do any good. It didn't do any good. And as a result of this, since then, people have assumed I'm a Democrat.
Right. Because,
you're judged to be of the party of the last administration that you serve. This is kind of silly in Washington, and there are some people who manage to cross over, but few. I think I'm the only person who was a political appointee in both the Reagan and Clinton administrations. It's possible that Dennis Ross is an exception.
Okay.
Dennis is an exception.
Right.
Although he served continuously, so he was thought to be part of the permanent government.
Right.
Whereas I was an in and outer and managed to do it. Our process is too partisan in the way people are picked. Yeah. It used to be that administrations got some credit for appointing somebody of the opposite, the other party. That's more rare these days, okay. And I think we we lose as a result of that.
Yeah, and I remember reading for some of the research I've done that there was actually a group that lobbied against your appointment when you had your confirmation hearings.
Yes, but that was on substance. It wasn't because of partisanship. They decided my policy views were incorrect. And so a bunch of groups representing hyphenated Americans from Eastern Europe of
Yes, it's the Polish American group that I read about.
The Polish American group was prominent, but they managed to corral every other East European ethnic group and convince them that I was a very bad sort and should not be allowed to have this job. And as a result, there was a long hold on my position.
Oh, okay.
This is another terrible feature of our system, that senators and even Senate staffers sometimes can put holds on nominees. Over the past several years, we've had an immense number of ambassadorial and other high-level appointees in foreign policy work held up by the Senate, sometimes for trading purposes. You know, I want that dam in my state, and if you want your ambassador, here's what it'll take. Sometimes it's because of policy disagreements. Sometimes it's sheer cussedness and spite. And we've had a lot of that of late.
Okay. So when you were ambassador, what did you actually do?
Well, the work of government is, of course, a daily process of handling minute and completely insignificant matters. You know, there are days when the most contentious problem you have to deal with is the press guidance for the noon briefing. But the work of the State Department cannot go past noon without addressing that. So people have to haggle, and many drafts of it go through different offices. In government, you are dealing with many masters, many constituencies, many different problems. You are trying to answer the day's mail. You're trying slightly to get ahead of the calendar, and in the rare cases where such an opportunity opens up, you're able to shape events. But the distribution of those responsibilities is very uneven. You're mostly answering the day's mail.
Okay.
And then, when you have a little bit of, what in the State Department they always call copious free time, which does not exist, you try to get a little bit ahead of the calendar. And very, very rarely, big opportunities open up. The other thing to say about, I'm not answering this very specifically, but the other thing to say about government work is it is very much a team effort, and you have to either hope that you are blessed with good colleagues who've been picked by other people for you to work with, or you have to pick them yourself if you're in a position where you have that responsibility. You can't do anything in government by yourself. And people who take a while to learn that are going to be less effective. You have to be able to organize the work of quite a large number of offices. There were, I believe, 4 or 5 offices that reported to me. There were 12 embassies. And we had to keep in touch with them overseas. Wow. You have to keep in touch with your own offices within the building, with other bureaus that believe they have a right to busy themselves in your affairs, with other agencies. Richard Holbrooke wrote a fabulous article in Foreign Policy 40-some years ago, in which he talked about the real cadre of people who were responsible for any one issue, and who would have to be consulted, or who would be part of the process. And as I recall, his number was something like 1,600 that you'd have to deal with. This is a very, very cumbersome process, and many of our institutions have gotten too big to actually work effectively. When I was in the National Security Council in the 80s, we had, I think, a staff of about 125, I'm making that up, significantly bigger than it had been in the Carter administration, which was already significantly bigger than it had been in the Nixon and Ford administrations. When McGeorge Bundy was Kennedy's national security advisor, he had a couple of dozen staffers in the National Security Council. Today, the NSC staff is somewhere north of 400 people, I believe. And that's too big. It exceeds the span of control. The National Security Advisor has no idea what most of those people are doing. You've probably already gotten a little bit beyond what you can do when the staff is 125 people. Right. But at 400, it's completely senseless. Almost everybody in Washington knows that the organization they're part of would be more effective, could get more done, and go home earlier if it were about a third to half the size. So one of the things you do in government is you just try to keep other people from getting in your way, and try to avoid getting in their way. It is a semi-dysfunctional process now, but an awful lot of the daily work is just coordination among all the people who have to put their stamp of approval on something before it can move a millimeter.
Well, when you weren't dealing with just bureaucratic coordination and dysfunction, what do you take away as some examples of memories of things that you feel that you accomplished, or particularly memorable events and meetings that you had?
Well, everybody who does this sort of work has the success stories that they can tell you about that worked exactly in textbook terms.
Do you have some?
Yes, I can give you a textbook success, and then I can describe other things that are much more ragged. I mean, here's the textbook success story. President Kuchma, president of Ukraine, came for the meeting of the Gore-Kuchma Commission. This was the consultative body between senior figures of the U.S. and Ukrainian governments.
So Vice President Gore on the American side.
Exactly. That was supposed to mirror the Gore-Chernomyrdin Commission, which was created between the Vice President and the Prime Minister of Russia. The two countries of the former Soviet Union that were entitled to imitators of this were the Ukraine and Kazakhstan, which got the Gore-Kuchma and Gore-Nazarbayev commissions.
Is that because they were the nuclear weapons holders?
It certainly helped. Yes, if you've got nukes, you get yourself a commission.
The countries that came out of the Soviet Union holding nuclear weapons.
Right. Although there are gradations of difference there. Vice President Gore only did what they called the home games of the Gore-Nazarbayev Commission. When we met in Kazakhstan, I was the stand-in for him, and then it was just me and the foreign minister of Kazakhstan. At any rate, back to the textbook story. President Kuchma came to Washington, and he informed the United States that Ukraine was going to renege on its commitments not to deliver parts for the Bushehr reactor in Iran.
The civilian reactor.
Which was a reactor that had originally been contracted by Iran with the West Germans, I believe. And then was taken up by the Russians, who filled in when the Germans pulled out. And there were a lot of very important defense industrial plants in Ukraine that provided parts for the reactor, turbines and so forth, which were the only ones that could supply these parts.
Okay.
The Ukrainians decided they needed the hard currency. The Russians had leaned on them, and they'd told us that they were now going to supply the parts within a time frame of such and such number of months.
Okay.
So, policy problem put on your plate.
Yes.
How to get the Ukrainians to change their minds yet again and say, well, we will not do that.
Okay.
And this was to me a little lesson in how negotiation works. You have to figure out what makes it worthwhile for the Ukrainians to do this. What is it worth it to us to offer in order to persuade them to do what we wanted? And how do we play it out? What's the orchestration of the inducements? And so instantly, we convened interagency meetings with all of the responsible players who are offering their bits of the U.S.-Ukrainian relationship that could be tweaked up or tweaked down. If the Ukrainians were prepared to play ball, they could be tweaked up. And if they were not going to play ball, how would they be tweaked down? And then we began sending people to Ukraine for discussions about which elements of this problem we could most successfully address within a feasible time frame, which things mattered to them. There were a number of things that were of interest to them, of course, that had commercial value that could rival the benefits that they were going to get from this sale to Iran. Other orders that could be placed in their nuclear industry. They had a big defense industry of which President Kuchma was himself an important figure. And they were becoming active in satellite launches. What might be the contracts that would be available there? What were the inducements that might be possible in helping Ukraine to establish the independence of its nuclear power sector from Russia, on which it was still completely dependent? What would it take for American companies to come in and fill the role that the Russians had played? What would be the opportunities there? What would be the benefits in terms of visibility from Ukraine's point of view in the way in which these concessions were made? Well, it became clear to us that it was going to be a good idea to send the Secretary of State. Once we had managed to tie up all of these inducements into the appropriate package, with a statement from the Ukrainian at the highest level by President Kuchma himself as to what Ukraine was and wasn't going to do. It was a kind of informal treaty with, it was certainly a legal document that had lawyerly language about what kinds of activities would be terminated. In the end, we decided that the thing to push for, if we were going to be jacking up our cooperation with the Ukrainians, we wanted them to terminate their cooperation with Iran. We thought this was the most verifiable arrangement. We wouldn't have to worry about discovering that suddenly Ukrainian engineers were turning up in Bushehr and what was the explanation of it. We just wanted to have a clean break. So we piled on all these inducements. We arranged for Secretary Albright to parachute into Kiev after a lot of consultations between our middle-level people and theirs. And in the course of landing in Ukraine early in the morning and later departing in the middle of the afternoon, she managed to get a document blessed by the President of Ukraine in solemn ceremony with between her representing the United States and Ukraine, and it all worked perfectly. We had a very, very strict timetable because her trip was scheduled, and we had to begin putting all these pieces into place over a number of weeks. And what had seemed like a car wreck in U.S.-Ukrainian relations, not to mention a negative development from the standpoint of U.S. nonproliferation policy, suddenly turned into a textbook success.
Great.
So we thought, wow. And my honest opinion is, I said it was a story about negotiating.
Yes.
My honest opinion is we grossly overpaid for this, and that it is nevertheless part of how you do business, because sometimes you just can't make it happen,
Right.
Unless you are prepared to throw everything at the problem.
So if it happens too easily, that means that you paid too much.
But the irony of this was that the Ukrainians quickly came to the conclusion that we had grossly underpaid for this. And so they would be going around bitching to American officials, we made this tremendous concession to you on Bashir. We had Albright come. We curried favor. We did absolutely everything that you wanted. And what have we gotten out of it? So this is another element of diplomacy. You have to have the explanation of what the other side has gotten out of it. And I had a few of my colleagues who would come back from Kiev saying, man, the Ukrainians are just complaining about how they got absolutely nothing. So we had to have the agreed, authorized talking points, what it is that Ukraine got out of this, as a reminder, so that every time anybody complained and said, no, we didn't get anything, we would say, no, that is incorrect.
Just pull out your little note card.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because we had in fact done a lot.
Right.
But it was the sort of package that was easy to slip from view because most Ukrainian officials weren't particularly familiar with any of these issues.
Right.
And most of them, after the press conference between Albright and Kuchma, forgot about it totally. They didn't see it. They didn't see the business investment group that came to visit Kharkiv to see, what could be done cooperative.
They probably have just as much bureaucratic complications.
So we just, my instructions to my staff were, everybody should be carrying around this little 3x5 card on which you have got all of the points that are that were part of the deal.
Yeah.
This is actually rather familiar part of diplomacy, because whenever you have a deal, somebody then starts, one party or the other starts having second thoughts about it and thinking, this did not go the way we wanted. I actually believe Russians are rather good at this, and they generally say, we didn't get anything out of X or Y or Z transaction. So the little 3x5 card that you have in your breast pocket that is the reminder of what it is, what are the facts of every transaction. It's very important, because otherwise a mythology gets created about what actually happened. So diplomats are not only responsible for doing deals, but for defending them afterwards and reminding everyone why they were advantageous.